Now, Bashar al-Assad, the regime leader, has been the strongman of throughout the entire Syrian civil conflict. He looked like he was on the back foot until the Russian intervention came to his aid, bolstered his forces, and forced the Syrian opposition into retreat. However, now there has been a split that is starting to emerge between Russia and the Assad regime. Now, the Assad regime has not just enjoyed support from Russia, the Assad regime has also enjoyed support from Iran. Russia and Iran have been cooperating on the same side in Syria because they both have joint interests. They both have joint interests in maintaining some kind of corridor to the Eastern Mediterranean. So for Iran, they have formed a Shia corridor which runs through the majority landmass of Iraq, which is ruled by a Shia majority government, and the Assad regime. Now, the Assad family themselves are part of the Alawite sect of Islam. It is a Shia sect of Islam, so they are natural allies for the Iranians. At the same time, the Russians have been supporting the Alawite sect, have been supporting this Alawite regime led by the Assad family, because the Assad family is guaranteeing Russia's interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, guaranteeing them access to the naval base in Latakia, which Russia basically needs in order to continue any kind of operation, any kind of presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Assad regime has been providing both of these countries with security for their national interests, and in return, the Assad regime has been receiving help from these countries to win the Syrian civil conflict. However, at times where Russian and Iranian interests can conflict, the Assad regime has been torn between its loyalties. Now, the way Russia sees it, Russia has been the one that has won the war for the Assad regime, because Russia has been the one that's given it the most support, not only militarily, but also diplomatically as well. Whereas Iran has been more focused on its own interests in the region, supporting its own proxies, Shia proxies, which does not bode well for countries such as Turkey and countries such as Israel, which both have their eyes on what's happening on Syria. Now, obviously, Russia has good diplomatic relations with Israel, and at the same time, Russia needs to work with Turkey in some way, shape, or form to restore some kind of stability in Syria. So, Iran getting involved and irking these two nations puts Russia in a very difficult position, and Russia has to really decide who does it need more in order to restore stability in this conflict. Does it need to work with Iran a lot more, or does it need to work with Turkey? Does it need to work with Israel? So Russia is in a sticky situation, a difficult position, and it seems that since Turkey has insisted on being involved in this conflict and has insisted on its own interests, Russia has been drawn a lot closer to working with Turkey rather than working with Iran. We can actually see a more direct cooperation between Turkey and Russia in northern Syria, whereas Iran is just kind of there doing its own thing and bringing about Israeli airstrikes, which recently have struck as north as Aleppo, which is an interesting point, because I don't believe we've seen Israeli airstrikes in Syria that far north up until a few days ago. In fact, the Israeli airstrikes have been mainly focused on the south, a lot closer to their own borders. But Israel has made it clear that they do not want Iranian involvement in Syria, and Russia is starting to play the game as well. They're trying to decrease Iranian involvement, so there is a lot of pressure on the Assad regime to cut off Iran and to make Iran leave Syria, make Iranian agents and operatives and military advisors to make them leave Syria and have Iran retreat back to its own borders. But the Assad regime cannot necessarily afford to do this right now, because the Assad regime needs whatever help it can get. Because Syria right now is in the midst of a huge economic crisis, one of the worst of its kind. And I discussed this in a previous podcast where I mentioned that the economic crisis in Syria has proven that Syria as a country cannot function unless it is restored to its traditional borders, including the east of the Euphrates, where most of its oil fields are. If Syria is just limited to the west of the Euphrates and basically where the Assad regime controls, even though it does have the ports of Tartus and the ports of Latakia, access to the open seas, this is not enough really for the country of Syria to function. This is the reason why the Assad regime has been so aggressive in its assault on the M4 and M5 highways connecting Damascus with the commercial capital of Aleppo, in order to speed up and in order to rejuvenate domestic trade within the country. Because the control of those roads are very vital for the state of Syria to continue to exist. So the Assad regime is getting desperate for whatever money it can get, for any support it can get in filling its own borders in a way. And at the same time, the Assad regime, the Assad family rather, is starting to see cracks in its unity because of this economic crisis. Now, one thing that the Assad regime has been doing in order to bolster its resources, its financial resources, is they have been heavily taxing and eliciting financial support from the few millionaires, billionaires that Syria has left. And they have been targeting actually Assad's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who he's a very well-known businessman in Syria. He's a telecoms tycoon, has a lot of money, and the family of Bashar al-Assad have set up a system in which Rami Makhlouf's businesses and employees are being targeted, arrested, probed. And Rami Makhlouf, from what I've read, has actually fled to the UAE, and from there he has been releasing videos criticizing Bashar al-Assad directly. Now, the reason why Rami Makhlouf has been targeted, in fact, Rami Makhlouf, we have to remember that he was a huge supporter of the Assad regime. He is still very much part of the system that Bashar al-Assad leads. In fact, he helped create that system, him and his family. But now that the economic crisis is hitting Syria, the playing field, so to speak, of economic activity in Syria has narrowed, and there is a lot more competitiveness to control resources in Syria between those who have it. And that has actually brought Rami Makhlouf, Assad's cousin, to loggerheads with his wife, Asma al-Assad, who also has business interests. So now that the playing field has narrowed, these two business factions are starting to step on each other's toes. So obviously Bashar al-Assad is siding a lot more with his wife in this competition, and Rami Makhlouf is finding himself getting sidelined. So we're seeing now cracks starting to develop within the Assad regime, within the Alawite sect even. The Alawite sect is not as united as we originally thought them to be, which could actually wind up playing to what Russia seeks to achieve in Syria. Now, Not too long ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, he came to Syria, he visited Syria, and he visited the Orthodox churches in Syria. Now we have to remember that Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. Syria is also home to a sizable Orthodox Christian minority, which is probably on par with the Alawites. So I see that Russia would prefer to work with the Orthodox Christian community than with the Alawites. Now, up until now, many of the minorities in Syria, the religious minorities in Syria, have been united behind the Assad regime, because the Assad family have been the strongest, they've had the strongest support network in order to maintain Syria as a stable state. And all of these minority groups, even though they have differences between themselves, they are united in the fact that they do not want to see a Sunni Muslim majority coming to power in Syria, because that way these minorities see themselves as getting weaker in the face of a majority ruling the country. So the minorities have been united behind Assad. And I believe that the minorities of Syria will continue to stay united, Alawis and Orthodox Christians alike. However, there may be a shift in the power balance within the regime. We may see Alawites who are closer to Iran taking a step back, while the Orthodox Christian community of Syria, supported by Russia, may step forward. Now, I'm not saying that Assad is going to get replaced by an Orthodox Christian leader, because I do not see the majority of the Syrian people who are Muslim accepting an Orthodox Christian leader. But I do see the Orthodox Christian community playing a greater role in the future of the leadership of Syria. Perhaps we might even see a Sunni Muslim leader of Syria who is a socialist and who is working with the minorities. Therefore, the majority won't have a problem with a Sunni Muslim leader, but many of his advisors and many of the businessmen close to him may be from the Orthodox Christian community. In fact, there is talk of removing Assad completely, removing Bashar al-Assad completely, and forming a new political coalition in Syria that will replace him, which will include Alawites, elements of the Assad regime without Assad, and elements of the moderate Syrian opposition. So there is a lot happening in Syria right now, and it's very difficult to say which direction it's going in. We can only take guesses, but it's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on how these dynamics continue to evolve in the future.